All right, everybody, welcome. Thanks for coming. So we have quite a mix of classes here today, but hopefully that will add to the dynamic of this meeting. I'm very glad to welcome Ronom Hertzmanom here, who's our special guest today, and who's been visiting the whole school. And today, now this session will be about kind of his heart specialty, in a sense, maybe a possibility for him to enrich us a little bit and engage with all of you in discussion. So thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Save your bar till the end. You might not like it. So I've got one thing to say, and that is make sure that if there's something that I say that you don't understand, or indeed if you have any questions along the way, don't be afraid to stop me, okay? I'm going to be asking you guys a lot of questions, so there's no reason why you shouldn't ask me some as well. And I think what I want to do here is convince everybody that C.S. Lewis School needs to have every student read Dante. Okay, so that's my modest goal. And I want to start by a couple of interesting examples. I sort of say this is why it's a really good reason to teach the old guys, right? And just sort of to see how old Dante is. First of all, how many of you have, in some form or another, heard of Dante? Okay, what do you know, if anything? Don't be shy. You heard something. What have you heard?
He wrote a lot.
He wrote
A lot. A lot of texts.
many texts. Okay. Do you happen to know what his biggie is?
Inferno?
Well, partly. Here's the deal. The poem, he wrote a lot. The poem that Dante is most famous for, I'm going to be doing this in English rather than in Italian. The English title, The Divine Comedy. The word divine was not Dante's own idea. Somebody gave it to the work a couple centuries after. Anybody have a clue when Dante lived? Long time ago. How long? Guessing is fine.
18th century?
Nope, got to go back a bit. Keep going back.
Right.
16th, back. 14th. Yeah, he's born in 1265 in the middle of the 13th, and he dies in 1321. He was writing the Divine Comedy toward the end of his life, and in fact he dies about 3 or 4 months after finishing the work. So, Divine Comedy, 3 parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. Hell, Purgatory, Heaven. The 3 parts of the Christian afterlife as it was understood in Dante's time. Now, the interesting thing about writing about the afterlife is that, well, let me ask it this way. Dante does a very strange thing. If you read earlier long epic poems, one of the things that's very interesting, say, for example, if any of you read the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, is that on anybody's to-do list? Virgil?
I want to, not yet.
I'm sorry, say loud.
I would like to, I haven't.
You would like to, okay. Well, the folks who Homer writes about are characters like Achilles and Hector. The folks that Virgil writes about are characters like Aeneas and Dido. The main character in Dante's Divine Comedy is Dante. Right, so he's writing a work that is sort of kind of autobiographical in a way. And the way he does this, okay, Dante's born in 1265. He lives in the what we now call city of Florence, but then it was like an independent country. And he was kind of talented, and 2 things that he did very well when he was a youth. One was he was involved in politics. The other was that he was a hotshot young poet. And by the time that Dante reaches his 35th year, he was sort of at the peak of his political career. He was what is called a prior, the highest elected official in Florence, and he was also a hotshot young poet. So the interesting thing that happens is that it all goes bad for him a little later. In 1302, Dante is kicked out of Florence. He's on the wrong side of a political squabble, and basically he is exiled from his home on pain of death. So for the last 19 years of his life, he's kicked out in 1302, he's wandering around other towns of Italy, basically at the mercy of other people's goodwill. In other words, people take him in as a well-known guy and say, you can hang with us for a while. So somewhere around maybe 1304, he realizes that he's never going to get back to Florence. He thought that if his party wins, he can come back. It didn't happen that way. He knows it. And so he's got to figure out what this whole business of exile means. So partly in order to do that, he begins studying a whole lot. And then somewhere around 1308, he begins to write the poem. So from 1308 till his death in 1321, that's a lot of years, he spends writing this huge epic poem. Now, the interesting thing about making himself the main character in the poem, he's the guy who takes the trip down into the afterlife. The interesting thing about it is that by setting the date here in 1300, the character that Dante invents, he calls Dante, doesn't know that he's going to be spending the rest of his life in exile. He thinks, he's going to be in Florence for the duration. And so the poet writing this poem is all about trying to figure out his own future, which is, of course, the past from the point of view of writing the poem later. Now, he takes this poem as an opportunity to meet all the folks who inhabit the afterlife. What do you need to be a member of Dante's afterlife? In other words, what do you need in order to be somebody that Dante potentially is going to meet on this journey?
You have to be dead?
You have to be dead. Yes. Very important. You have to be dead by the year 1300. So just to give you an example of the extremes, if we were to continue the journey, maybe next time I'm back here we can do a little bit of Purgatory and a little bit of Paradiso. When Dante's in Paradiso, one of the people that he meets is Adam. You can't get farther back than that. And one of the people that we meet in the Inferno turns out to be a guy who barely made the cut. In other words, it's somebody who died in 1298. So, what that means is that Dante has this amazing number of people that he is able to meet because it's everybody who ever lived from the beginning of time all the way up to the present. Okay, you got to be dead. Any other rules besides that? This is Inferno. Modern translation, or the English translation of Inferno, of course, is hell. All right.
So to be in hell, you have to be a sinner.
Yes.
Then you have to be a not sinner.
All right. So you need to be dead by 1300, and you need to be a sinner. Huh. Well, that would include a lot of people. One interesting question, though, is to ask what you need to be parts of the other realms of the afterlife. What do you need to be an inhabitant of purgatory or to be an inhabitant of paradise? Turns out they're also sinners. The difference is that the folks that he meets in hell turn out to be what we call unrepentant sinners. Folks who never said they're sorry. Folks who sort of are sinners and are glad of it, if you can make that a sort of a neat way to think about it. All right? So, what kind of people is Dante going to find who are sinners and unrepentant sinners from all of the possibilities that exist out there?
Nice people.
Nice?
Yeah, because the...
What's your name, by the way?
Dusan.
Dusan.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
Popular name.
church and and all the things was very strict, and by today's standards it was really like really prohibiting many things that are normal today. So you would find many people that are considered good now, even in hell.
Mm. Yeah, maybe not so much. We'll come back to that in a minute, but there are at least a whole bunch of folks that we see down there that we would not think of as very nice. Somebody, for example, who's eating the skull of his enemy. That's not so nice. But you've got a very good point, and I'm going to come back to it in a bit. Okay? Good. Thank you. Yeah.
May I? I'm afraid that I didn't clearly understand the concept of the hell itself. I mean, is it the Christian hell where all the people who did not believe in Christian God end up? Or
No.
is it no? So
No.
what kind of hell is this?
It's the place where unrepentant sinners go. All right?
Which means bad people, or?
Yeah, people who, but I'm saying that they're people who want to be there, who have made a choice who have made a choice to live a particular kind of life. And what Dante, the poet, does is try to explain what that might mean. The short version of it is that the people in hell stay who they were at the moment they died. In other words, they're kind of frozen into what kind of people they had become over the course of their life. Does that help a bit?
Yes.
Okay. Now, there's one other thing that Dante does that's really unusual and really demands that we think about it a good deal. He can go to anybody who wants, as long as he wants, as long as they are dead by 1300. But one of the things that he does not make a distinction between are people who really, really lived. In other words, historical figures. Julius Caesar, name somebody else who lived. People from the Bible. People who were politicians and poets in Dante's own time. People for whom we have historical records. And people who are fictional characters from books. Have you guys done anything with Shakespeare?
Yes.
Okay, name a play that you've read.
Hamlet.
Hamlet, perfect. What Dante does is something like this. Supposing you were to walk into a bar, and you looked at one end of the bar, and there's Shakespeare drinking, I don't know, a Guinness or some nice beer and laughing and having a really great time. And if you look at the other end of the bar, all dressed in black and morose and downing triple vodkas, is Hamlet. Now, notice that that takes two levels of reality and matches them together. Okay? Hamlet, of course, only exists because he is a fictional character created by Shakespeare. Dante takes fictional characters like that. Shakespeare obviously lives several hundred years after Dante, but he takes fictional characters like that and lets them occupy the same level of reality. Everybody see that concept? So why would he want to do that? Why would he want to cross the line or make the line blurry between those people who are fictional and those people who are real? What does the poem get out of that?
Maybe that he wants to show that the difference between fiction and reality is not that big.
Yeah, that's very good insight. He wants to deliberately blur that line. Good. Any other reasons that you can think of why he wants to do that? And by the way, one of the things that he's doing is creating a fiction, and one of the great lines of criticism in the past century is the fiction of the Divine Comedy is that it's not a fiction. Okay? So good. What else does he gain from having people who are real and people who are fictional? Yeah.
Maybe he's overall emphasizing that the importance of imagination, like it matters what we think, and it matters what we are imagining. You know?
Yes, I would say that that's very strong. Good. What else? Notice that it gives him a much bigger gene pool. Are you familiar with that term? A much bigger field to draw from. In other words, if he's looking for an example, the best example might come from fiction rather than from reality, or the other way around. Notice also that very often we happen to know more about fictional characters than we know about real people. Let me give you a particular example of that. One of the things that's, the example that we've already used, we actually know a lot more about Hamlet than we do about Shakespeare, because we get to go into Hamlet's inner life. We get to see things that authors let us see that sometimes real life does not. Okay?
Sorry, there are several of you who need to go, right? So maybe just let's make transition. Those of you who have to go.
Okay.
Unfortunately, not everyone can stay the whole 2 hours. The rest of us maybe let's use Kujak and continue. Thanks for coming at least for a bit. And see you. The rest of us guys, let's maybe come closer. I didn't want the gradual to be distracting me.
Okay, so he's got this huge gene pool. He can choose anybody, real or fictional, as long as they live between 0 and 1300, or whatever BCE number you want to pick. Why does he choose some rather than others? In other words, who's he going to choose?
Well, that depends on the whole point of his writing. I mean, I don't know what he's trying to do because I don't know anything about that work, but I think it's something about human character, no? He's trying to reflect what people are because he's choosing some specific types of people and he's taking the best examples that he can.
Good. Yeah. Then he's trying to take those examples that will make his points the author make his points most emphatically, all right? But it's in 2 ways. One is for us, the audience. In other words, when he sets up categories, he takes the folks who are best likely to represent what those categories are all about, okay? But the other thing is that he chooses the people who have some particular relevance to his own life, right? As a politician and as a poet, okay? And so he operates as a kind of representative of all of us, and yet he operates as somebody with a very particular biography up to the year 1300. So one of the things that I tell my own students is that it's kind of as though Dante had invented the largest possible classroom for him to learn from, right? That the poet chooses all of those folk who are going to be the ones who have the most to say about him personally. So, another way to think about the folks that he encounters in the Inferno is that he's going to encounter sort of mirror images of himself in some way. People whose lives intersect with his own in some serious manner. And he's going to find in them things that he needs to correct in himself. The concept of hell that Dante develops is that these are not only people who made serious wrong decisions at some point in their life, but they made serious wrong decisions and stuck with them. That they did not see, or they did not turn back to something Dante would see as a bit more human. So this is the sort of just background, just sort of the framework within which the poem operates. So a couple other big things I want to talk about before we go crawling through the text. Let me stop here for a second and say, any questions that you have about the ground that we've covered so far? Right, Dante takes a journey to the afterlife. He's the protagonist. He sees people who are in some way mirrors of himself, and therefore it is a learning experience for him. Yeah?
How does he explain in the book that what enables him to travel to Inferno, to all the stages of the afterlife? Because the normal people there can't just travel abroad.
That's a great question. The way he sets it up, well, let's look at the very beginning, all right? So, Canto 1, excuse me. So, midway through the journey of our life, thanks so much. Midway through the journey of our life, I found myself within a dark wood, for the straight way had now been lost. Okay, so he finds himself essentially disorganized and sort of in a bit of a daze. We would probably call it nowadays, he's in a midlife crisis and he needs a way out. So help comes from him, help comes for him, and he's given a guide, a divinely sanctioned guide, the poet Virgil. And the point seems to be that he gets this special trip not because he has earned it, but because he's so far gone that this is the only way that he can kind of recover. So what I like to do is sort of call the Inferno electroshock therapy for Dante's soul. And so he gets to do this not as a reward, not as a prize, but because that's the only means for him to come back to the true way. So he sets it up in such a way that the farther down he goes into the pit, the more frightening it is, but it also is the means for his being sort of shaken back to reality. Okay? Good. Yeah?
Isn't it Dante who has to cross the 7 circles of hell, or 9 circles?
9 circles.
Oh, I played the game. It's like this.
Yeah.
Goal in mind when he's traveling through these?
Yeah. He doesn't, when he starts out, know what the goal is yet. It's sort of in the making, and so by the end of the entire poem, the goal becomes pretty clear. But the goal that the poet sets up for his pilgrim fictional character and for us, the reader, is to understand something of the nature of evil. And that includes, why is it that so many people do things that are harmful to others and harmful to themselves? What makes it so attractive? So that's one of the things that he has to discover or uncover. And the other is, what sort of practices will help you avoid that? In other words, here are these people who fell into a particular pattern of terrible behavior. Dante, you're doing something like that yourself. Let's try and show you why that's not a cool thing to do. So that's kind of the initial goal, is to sort of reorient himself to the truth by finding out the attractiveness of evil and also the destructive quality of evil. And no matter, if you were to do the whole poem, you would come across people who are doing horrendous things for others. The basic notion of Dante's Inferno is that the more the person who is victimized the most by evil is the person who commits it. Right? So that there's a sense in which what he has to do is learn the self-destructive quality of people who have essentially done things that look like they're mostly directed against others. Okay? Does that help? Good. And so, the sense of sinners that he meets, it's very tricky. They don't say, here's where I screwed up. They basically spend most of their time defending themselves to Dante. And all of the figures that Dante meets turn out to have a couple of characteristics in common. Characteristic number one is they are always out to blame someone or something else for why they are there. All right? And some of them are really quite ingenious about that. And the second thing that kind of follows from that is that they're all very clever, but they're all lying their butts off. In other words, we cannot take what they are saying as the best representation of what really happened. Okay? And so part of the fun of reading the Commedia, or reading the Inferno in particular, is for us to kind of decipher the lies that they're all telling to Dante. Because they're very good at it. That's who they are and who they've become. And so one of the things that follows from that, and this is one of the most important things that Dante does, the punishments that they receive are not punishments that are sort of thrown on them from above. Okay, God thought it'd be a lot of fun to keep these people in a, as you see at the end of the Inferno, in a encased in ice, let's say. It turns out that those punishments are reflections of who they have become. That they are living the life in the Inferno that they lived above, but without any of those, what do I want to say, distractions by which they sort of said it was a cool thing to do. Yeah?
I have a question. Is Dante aware of that the truth is being given by
A super question. And the answer is no in the beginning. And as he moves on, he begins to kind of catch on. Think of him as a particularly dumb student in the beginning because he's just emerged from this dark wood and lacks direction. And so his tendency at the beginning is for him to sympathize with the people that he sees. Okay?
That was quite present in the first few cantos.
Yeah. Sorry. Good. Any other questions? So, this is not in the playbook. Okay, so I think what I want to do is to take a quick look at Canto 5 to see what it is that Dante essentially, how Dante learns. Canto 5 is a very good primer for learning how to read the Commedia. Now, Canto 5, you know the basic move is the farther down you go, the more serious the sin, right? One way to think about it is that the farther down you go, the more, that's very cool. The farther down you go, the more thought is involved. The farther down you go, the smarter the sinners are, and the more calculated they are. So, to give you an example, there are three general categories for the 9 circles. The name that scholars give to them is, the first is what's called incontinence, the second is violence, and the third is fraud. So Dante says what these are perversions of, here are appetites. It's kind of interesting that the first appetite we see is sex, and then after that food and drink, and then after that money. Violence is connected with our desire as humans to be, to succeed, all right? And so this would be what, going all the way back to the philosophers like Plato, and spiritedness, and fraud.
Ratio?
Sorry?
Would you write, I can't see that, but isn't it the Plato's concept of human soul?
Yes.
Okay.
That's where Dante gets it. What he does is turn it upside down. Okay, so incontinence, violence, and fraud are perversions of appetite, spirit, and excellence. One way to see it is that in each of these 3 big divisions, there's one canto that deals with sex and one canto that deals with money. All right, and those 2 for Dante are not necessarily unconnected. And so what I want to do is to just sort of to show you the difference, talk a little bit about sex in 5, and then mention what happens when we get to fraud. So 5 is all about lust. And the big story that we're going to see is the story of a woman named Francesca who was caught doing it with her husband's brother, okay, and was killed in the act. And this is an event that actually took place, all right, in Dante's own time. When you get down to fraud, the sexual sin turns out to be, what would we call it nowadays? The folks who are there are pimps, okay? Now, the difference should be apparent. What pimps do is make a good living off the lust of somebody else. All right? Everybody see that? What's going on there? That it's not like they're subject to uncontrollable desires. It's like they know other people are, and that if they get the right women to work for them, they can make a ton of money. So, in making that distinction, you learn something about the difference between sins of the appetite and sins of the intellect. All right? So, with that in mind, let's turn to Canto 5 and see what we can get out of the Canto of Lust. And it turns out that this is sort of a super good canto for learning about Dante's own methodology, for learning about how he constructs the world of the Inferno. Because this is the first major encounter between the pilgrim and a figure in the afterlife. Canto 1, he meets his guide, Virgil. By the way, why do you need a guide when you're going down through hell?
So we can go back up.
Say what?
So we can return.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting is that he does return precisely because Virgil has been there before and knows the territory. Okay, so that's one reason why Virgil's a good guide. And it's the ways of hell are kind of tricky. You need somebody who can bring you along. All right, so the first time, Canto 1, he meets Virgil. Canto 2, Virgil has to spend a lot of time convincing Dante to take this journey. Canto 3, we pass through the gates of hell, but Dante doesn't really get to talk to anybody, and these are sort of outsiders, folks who don't belong to any of the categories. Canto 4, we run into a group of people who have not done anything right, but did not have what Dante sees as right belief. So Canto 5, first time Dante the Pilgrim meets an inhabitant of hell who interacts with him. And so let's see what we find out. Everybody want to turn to line 40 as flocks of starlings beat their wings? 140. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to test your skills. Somebody want to read for a while for me? Give my cough a chance to relax here. Don't be shy. You look like you're ready. You. No? Just try it, you might like it.
As flocks of starlings beat their wings and fly in the cold, clear, proud in the air, so too that wind drove these accursed souls upward and downwards, and this way and that. Without hope of comfort or even lesser pain, without hope of repose forevermore, and as cranes fall into long lines in the sky, chanting their rounds as they wing their way on, so too I saw coming the songs of grief, shadows blown on by the force of the wind.
Not too much longer.
And I asked, Master, who are these people, and why does the black air punish them so?
Okay, good. Very good, thank you. That was quite excellent. So here you have this picture of sinners being blown around by the wind. And eventually, Dante will talk with two of them. But before he does, it's like we name all of these folks who are there. So on line 52, the first of those whose stories you long to learn my guide began was an empress with domination over many tribes and tongues. She was so abandoned to sensual vice that she made lust legitimate in her laws to expunge the shame that she had incurred. She is Semiramis. We read of her that as widow of Ninus, she ascended his throne and held the land the Sultan now rules. Well, what's interesting there, the part of the story that he doesn't tell directly, is that the law that she changed, after her husband died, she married her son. Okay? And since there's usually an incest taboo, she changed the law to make it legal. So that's the very first person. And I'm not sure whether Dante's time would have thought of her as one of the real or one of the fictional characters, but for sure we think of her as fictional now. And they go on and list a whole bunch of other people who essentially are figures of song and story, Beside her is she who cut short her life for love unfaithful to Sichaeus' ashes. That's Dido, the unfortunate queen of Carthage in Virgil's Aeneid. Notice that Virgil is Dante's guide, and we've just met one of the characters from Virgil's own poem. So this is like Shakespeare running into Hamlet. All right, next to her is the lascivious Cleopatra. Look now at Helen, about so many seasons of ill revolved. The great Achilles, who in his first hour did battle with love. See Paris and Tristan, 1,000 shades or more he pointed out and named, each severed by love from our mortal life. All right, so the big picture. And notice that they're all being blown around. What you need to know about the setting for Dante's Inferno is that in some way or other, the geography of hell represents the sin itself. All right? That the punishment is somehow crystallized in the kind of geography that Dante presents. So here are all these people being blown by the wind without any, what do I want to say here, without any control of what direction they take. They're not the ones who can turn the steering wheel. They're like birds being blown on a big wind. How is that somehow an image for lust?
Because when lust takes control over the decisions of a man, he's like he's just like that. He's just like jumping fan.
Yeah. So that this is a geographic, quote unquote, way of saying out of control.
Yeah.
Out of control. And so you've got that as kind of a background, and then he says, I'm going to talk with two of them, and it looks like it's because he recognizes them, okay? So, here's what this soul says to Dante. This is on page 49, line 88. Excuse me. Anybody else want to do a reading thing? Brilliant example has been set.
From Over the Soul.
Yes. Good, thank you. What's your name?
Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
O living soul, so gracious and kind, to brave the black air and visit us, who dyed the earth the color of blood. If the King of the universe were our friend, we would pray to him to grant your peace. Since you have taken pity on our woe, whatever pleases you to speak or hear, that we will listen to or speak ourselves, while the wind is quiet as the wind is now. The city where I was born lies on the shore, where the river Po comes down to the sea, with all its tributaries to rest in peace. Love, which kindles quickly in the gentle heart, impassioned this man with my beautiful form, taken from me in a way that still wounds. Love, which excuses no beloved from loving, filled me with passion so strong for this man that, as you will see, it has not left me yet. Love led us both to share in one death, kinda waits him who snuffed out our life. These words drifted upon the wind to us.
Super, thank you. So notice that in the great Who Can I Blame For It contest, the first thing she does is blame love. Who made you do it? Love made me do it. And she presents it in such a way that it seems like she's naming love as it were an actual person. Okay? Love came, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So, love which kindles quickly in the gentle heart, love which excuses no one from loving. All right? When you're caught by the flame of love, that's it. Love led us both to share in one death. Again, as the story had it, and it would have been well known in Dante's time, when the husband came home, saw them doing it, she and her friend Paolo were killed on the spot. Now, again, what she's not mentioning here is that this lover, from whom she had no control over, was her brother-in-law. Okay? Something a little bit kinky about that. All right. Now, since it is a story that is well known, Dante wants to know more. He's clearly intrigued by this. This is, excuse me, this is his getting the inside skinny on a story that he knows only from whatever the 14th century equivalent of newspaper headlines would have been. And that's one of the neat things, of course, is that what Dante the poet is able to do is reinvent the story in the afterlife that was not available to him up above. So that, the phrase I use, what Dante the poet does is he historicizes fiction. He makes fictional characters seem real, and he fictionalizes history. In other words, Dante is inventing a big story from the details that are known. This is sort of, the story that was known was the tip of the iceberg. In the Inferno, he gets to see the whole iceberg. All right? And so she's telling her story about how this came to pass. When I heard these wounded souls, I bowed my head and kept it low until the poet finally asked me, "What are you brooding on?" When I could speak again, I answered, "Ah, how many sweet thoughts, how much desire drove those lovers to this sorrowful pass." Then turning to the lovers, I spoke again. Francesca, Dante obviously knows the name because it's a headline story. "The suffering you endure moves me to weep in pity for your pain. But tell me this, in that time of sweet sighs, how, by what means did love grant to you the knowledge of your hesitant desires?" All right, so the general story, love made me do it. And then Francesca tells the story. This is a bit more here. This goes more deeply into it. And she answered, "There is no greater sorrow than to recall a time of happiness in a time of misery, as your teacher knows." Teacher means Virgil, your guide, since he himself has written about that unhappy love stuff. "But if you have so great a desire to learn what first made us fall in love, I will tell it as one who weeps and tells. One day we two were reading for pleasure of Love's Mastery over Lancelot." What do you know about Lancelot?
He was a knight in Dantem.
He was reading for kicks, all right? It's kind of as if, well, first of all, you got to ask the question, what were those two doing, being alone, reading a love story? It's kind of like they were saying, well, we were all alone, so we popped on the bed and put a little softcore porn into the VCR, and imagine what happened next. We had no idea, we had no suspicion, okay? As we read the story, our eyes would meet and our faces pale at each other's glance. But at one point only did we taste defeat, when we read how the longed-for smile was kissed, the smile of Guinevere by her great lover, this man with whom I keep eternal tryst, meaning that the two of them are kind of floating around together, even though he doesn't do any talking. This man with whom I keep eternal tryst, trembling all over, placed his lips on mine. That book and its author were our Galahold, and that day we read not another line. That's a cool line, and I think we need to kind of play with that a bit. The word Galahold there, he's the guy in a lot of medieval romances who brings the lovers together. All right? You're married to somebody else, this has got to be all secret. Here's the guy you call on to make sure nobody's watching. Well, she's saying it's the book that was our pander. It was the book that was our pander. So I want to get as much as we possibly can about the line that way, that day we read not another line. What are all of the different implications of that word, or of that phrase? Why didn't they read another line?
They did other stuff.
They were doing other stuff, yes. There was a T-shirt or sweatshirt that the English department at my university put out saying, Geneseo English, home of textual gratification. Well, they changed it from textual gratification to another kind of gratification. Good. Why else did they read no further? Why else did they read not another line?
Because they were killed?
Yeah, because they were discovered and killed on the spot. All right? But notice that it also means that if they had read further, they would have discovered that the Lancelot Guinevere King Arthur story is not a how-to story. It's a warning against exactly the thing that they wound up doing. So it's important to keep reading, or better yet, it's important not to read only for delight. It's important to read and see how the rest of the story comes out. Right? That day we read no further. Notice that in the beginning, she was saying it was love that made us do it. And now, even better, she's putting the blame on the book. The book made us do it. All right? So, this is a really good start to two major themes that are in all 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy. And if one were to continue from Inferno to Purgatory to Paradise, those themes are followed almost relentlessly. Theme number one, what is love? All right? So the definition of love that's given here, uncontrolled desire, turns out to be not a very good definition at all. The very last line of the 13,000 or so lines that make up the Divine Comedy is the love that moves the sun and the other stars, divine love. How we get from this very undivine love to the divine love at the end is, in fact, the story of the Commedia. And the second lesson is that Dante is very concerned that people read carefully, not per diletto for kicks, but in a much more serious and sustained way, and continue it to the end. Right? That day we read no further. Well, you ought to pick it up and start reading it the next day. Okay? So how to read correctly is one of the main themes in the book, and what the nature of love is in the other. Is the other. So this sense that what we're doing is giving bad examples of things to get us started is very important. Notice that Dante seems to be taken in by this story. That is to say, the pilgrim on the journey swoons at this time. What might that indicate?
Can you please repeat that?
Dante swoons when he hears the story of Francesca. He's very moved by it.
That he's feeling sorry for her.
Yes. Okay. So the question then becomes, how come? And one thing to think about is that an awful lot of Dante's early love poetry sounded exactly like the kind of language that Francesca is using. So that in a sense, what he's doing is sympathizing with something that he himself is probably implicated in. Right? That this is the first example of the stories that the sinners tell Dante are in some ways a mirror of his own condition. Right? And so a kind of bond between Dante and the sinner in the sense that Dante participates in the same thing and has to learn from experience to kind of separate himself from what the various folks are saying. Okay? Let me stop for a minute. By the way, how much time do we have? When does this?
We'll finish 4 to 5.
Cool. Very good. Very good. So I've got 25 minutes?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. So,
may I have a question? Sorry for interrupting.
sure.
Well, how are we supposed to read this book when we need a professor to explain us every line properly?
That's a good question. What the professor does, which is to say what I'm doing now, is giving you the tools to be able to do it by yourself, by showing what Dante's characteristic method is. All right, so slow going at the beginning, not so much later on. Just to give you an example from my own teaching of Dante, as we're going later, I teach a whole semester, whole term's worth of Dante, and as we're going on, the sorts of paper questions or that I expect from my students are to take a canto, let's say, that we haven't done in class, and give it a rigorous reading. You've got to know things that are, you've got to follow along, but then you begin to get the groove. And it's, this probably is something you already know, the farther back in time you go, the more things have to be explained because there's this, chasm in terms of how folks looked at the universe and so on. So I think that Dante is one of those poets that you really do need a guide for at the beginning, but then at the end, we all kind of become co-creators of the moment of insight as we're reading along and seeing things. This particular canto, it's interesting, when I was teaching it in this maximum security prison, the fact that she was putting the blame on somebody else occurred to one of the inmates very early, and he said, that's what I did, that's why I'm here. And all of a sudden there was this moment where, we thought we were going to be teaching something to them. They were teaching something to us because of the experience that they brought to the text. What a good Dante teacher is doing is giving you the ground rules to enable you to do it yourself. And, again, if this is your first shot at it, it's going to take a bit before you get there. And Dante is one of those, and I think, if you guys you mentioned you've done Hamlet. Hamlet's pretty tough the first time through. And I think it takes a lot of explaining on the part of somebody, whether you do it together as a kind of study group or whether, there's a sage on the stage who's sort of saying, now this is what it is and that's what that is. And then all of a sudden you kind of get into the, I think I know what he's doing now and can figure it out on your own. But like anything else, any kind of skill that you learn, reading, the problem with reading is most of us think we already know how to do it. But it really, what we know how to do are certain things, and in other things, you need somebody to say how you get from where you are to where it is there. And it's really tough to negotiate between coming to Dante for the first time, which is a lot of fun for one set of reasons, and coming to Dante for the 50th time for another set of reasons. Because I have never taught the course without seeing an enormous number of new things, but there's also nothing as great as the oh wow moments you have when you sort of figure it out, oh, that's what he's doing, especially with somebody who is as ultimately profound and interesting as Dante is. Okay? Okay. What else? What else do we need to do? Okay, so south in Italy. The papal states were kind of the middle. Rome and above and below Rome as far as Naples. So these were the two big powers at war with each other, more or less for control over Italy. parenthetically, Dante was not very happy with the fact that the Pope had any armies whatsoever. But in any case, when they played dirty. So that when one side won, they were likely to be pretty severe in their treatment of the other side. Okay? And Dante's exile was a result of just such a squabble, and oftentimes it was accompanied by a tremendous amount of street violence. Right? People ambushing, knifing, banging to death with long pieces of wood, but not all that uncommon in Florence and the other Italian city-states. And there were a lot of wars being fought between territories that were largely Guelph or territories that were largely Ghibelline. So Dante was at Guelph, and the first person that he meets in this part of hell was the leader of the Florentine Ghibelline party, right? Basically the generation before Dante. That's about the minimum of background to understand this. I'm going to ask you to do some pretty tricky interpreting here. Pick it up, if you will, over on line 22. Old Tuscan. A reader from this side? A reader from the back? Yeah, you.
Me?
Why not?
Oh, Tuscan, speaking with such civility, as you go alive through the city of fire, may it please you to stop a while in this place. Your manner and accent,
yeah, sure,
clearly show you to be a native son of that noble city, to which I perhaps caused too much harm.
Okay, stop there for a minute. This is a voice that comes at Dante without his being, he's walking along with Virgil, and all of a sudden he hears this voice coming at him. That line that you read, your manner and accent clearly show you to be a native of that noble city to which I perhaps caused too much harm. In other words, what he's saying to Dante is, I recognize you by your Tuscan accent. Okay? How many of you have been to Italy? Cool. Anybody speak Italian a little bit?
Buongiorno.
In Italy, that will get you a lot, actually. The craven Italians will, you say buongiorno, and they say, oh, you speak Italian so beautifully. And then they charge you double for the cappuccino. It's a matter of dialect. When Italy was united as a country in the middle to the 1860s and so on, in the 19th century, as they said, they had a country, but they didn't have a language because there were so many different dialects. And what happened is that they chose, in fact, the Tuscan dialect as the one that would become standard for all of Italy. Dante probably didn't know this in 1308 or 1310 when he's writing this, but it was largely because it was Dante's language. Dante himself was seen as kind of a poster boy for the Italian unification. So they said, all right, we've got ourselves a country, now we need a language. But they sort of preferred the Roman pronunciation. So now the deal is, the best Italian is La lingua toscana in bocca romana, Tuscan language in a Roman mouth. So here he is kind of, you speak elegantly, I speak elegantly. Tuscans, of course, during this time thought that they were the height of human evolution. There they are speaking together. He recognizes him because of the accent. So, fellow citizens of the same place who engage a lot of the good vibes that I've been getting about C.S. Lewis School here is the sense of community that you have and sort of being able to give yourself to a number of common enterprises. You would think that that's what happens when two people from the same part of the world meet somewhere else. Okay? And so the sound of his voice issued so suddenly from one of the monumental coffins that in fear I drew closer to my guide, who said, "What are you doing? Turn around, look at Farinata there, who has risen upright. You will see him all from the waist on up." So Farinata, as it turns out, was the leader of the Florentine Ghibellines in the previous generation, and would have been a fairly famous guy. I'm trying to think what the modern equivalent might be. For me, I don't know if this name resonates with you, but I'd be taking a trip through hell, and I'd turn around and he'd say, "See, Richard Nixon has just come up from the waist up." I had already fixed my eyes on his as he rose with chest and brow thrown back as if he had nothing but scorn for hell. The assured and ready hands of my guide were pushing me through the tombs to him, and he told me, "See that your words are apt." When I looked at the foot of Farinata's tomb, he looked me over briefly, and then asked, "Who were your ancestors?" as if with disdain. Why does he want to know who Dante's ancestors were?
Because you said that you could like inherit political.
Yes, a good part of it is, let's see what party you're on, or what party you are with. Good. Why else? Sort of connected to that.
To know if, like, well, he's in hell for hurting a lot of people, so maybe he would want to know if he hurt somebody.
Well, one of the things that's very interesting about that is that Farinata is kind of a guy who claims not to be all that concerned with hell, although he really is. What's your story? All right, so it's partly to say that. Good, good. What else? If I were to ask you, who were your ancestors? Is it because I'm just taking a DNA test? What?
Middle class? From which he's from?
Well, I'm asking the question, why would I want to know who your ancestors are?
Know what is my social background, like how should you talk to me, like if I'm equal to you, like I'm
Yes, yeah, exactly so. So I know who's higher on the food chain.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now Farinata is speaking knowing that Dante is not going to be as high as he is, because Farinata believes that he is, the height of all human existence. So he's asking the question basically so that he can establish the hierarchy with him on top. And then he says, "I was eager to comply and did nothing from him, but told him all," at which he lifted up his brow a little and then said, "They were hostile to me, so not once but twice I scattered them, enemies to my family and party." So he's sort of taking pride at the fact that his folk beat the crap out of Dante's folk. Okay? Now notice also that he's saying, and this is kind of interesting, he's saying they were hostile to me, enemies to my family, and to my party. The three things that he's interested in himself, his family, his party. What's he not interested in? Yeah, he's got no sense of a community outside of self-family party. A great question. Who is included in your community? This is clearly a question that as a school you guys are asking yourselves. And what Farinata is doing is limiting his community very, very precisely and saying that nobody else counts. And so what there's no conception of is a community larger than that. That my party does not exist so that I can make things better for the country as a whole. My party exists so that I can make it better for myself. Now the interesting thing here is that Dante jumps right in and plays the same game. Right? If they were driven out, this is line 49, they always return from every quarter, I answered him, and aren't your people have hardly learned. Well, it turns out that Dante, they're now playing My Father Can Beat Up Your Father. And Dante's playing the same game as they are. What he's doing is essentially talking about something that happened after Farinata was dead, that Farinata doesn't know anything about. In other words, Farinata knows who was in charge when he died. He doesn't know who's in charge now. And one of the things that we find out here is that the people in hell have this peculiar ability. They know something about the past, and in many cases they also know something about the future and have absolutely no knowledge of the present. So Dante says, yeah, you kicked our ass, but I kicked, my party kicked your ass several years later. And at this point, in other words, in the year 1300, the Ghibelline party is basically kicked out of Florence for good. Florence becomes almost entirely Guelph city. The problem there is that the Guelphs themselves divided into two factions, and Dante is going to be on the losing side of that one. Do you see how it's here a combination of party, class, and individual snobbery? Right? The way we gain our own identity is by finding enemies. Right? And generally speaking, the enemies that we find turn out to be kind of mirror images of ourselves. All right? Oddly enough, the enemies that we find very often turn out to be the folks who are most like us. So, at that point, there's kind of an interruption by another figure, and we don't have time to do that now, but I want to pick it up. If you think of this as sort of a fight between Dante and Farinata, Farinata starts by saying, we kicked your ass back then in 1248 and 1260. Dante comes back and says, yeah, but what about 1267? And then, over on line 73, but the other one, that great soul at whose request I had stopped, kept the same expression and did not turn his head or bend his waist, picking up the speech where he had left off, and he said, if they have learned that art badly, that torments me more than this bed of flames. But the face of that lady who rules here below will not be relit 50 times in the sky before you learn the true weight of that arm. Okay, so one of Dante's rules, no reference to light or the sun in Inferno. The lady who rules down here is the moon. And so 50 times the moon is 50 months. Right? 4 years plus a couple. So what does it mean when Farinata says to Dante, if they have learned that art badly, remember the art is learning to come back after you've been sent into exile. If they learned that art badly, that torments me more than this bed of flames. But the face of that lady who rules here below will not be relit 50 times in the sky before you will learn the weight of that art. So what is Farinata saying to Dante?
That they're going to exile him?
Yes, that they're going to kick your sorry ass out, and that he's not predicting when the exile takes place, because the exile is in 1302. This puts it sometime around 1304. What he's saying is, by then, you'll learn that you're not coming back either. So, notice what Dante the poet has brilliantly done. He's basically saying that this factionalism business means nobody's ever going to be happy. It's just going to keep going back and forth. But also, this is the first sustained prediction of Dante's exile in the poem. And another way of looking at the poem, the Divine Comedy, how Dante the Pilgrim learns to prepare for exile. And so now he knows what's going to happen to him in the future. So the nifty thing that Dante is able to do, of course, is to take all of the things that happen between the time that he sets the poem in 1300 and the time that he writes the poem. By now it's probably 1310 by the time he gets here. So all that 10 years of stuff that has already happened in the fiction of the poem becomes a prediction of the future. Okay? And so that's one of the things that really makes the poem sing, as all of these things kind of are presented to Dante, and he has to sort of figure out how to deal with it. Okay, time. What do we have here?
Last minute.
5 minutes?
Last one.
Okay, so I want to tell a Dante joke, or better yet, I want to end with a simony joke. Is there a bread company here? Is there a famous kind of bread in Bratislava? Well, Bratislava bread, that's the best I can do right now. All right. The next canto that I wanted to do, well, a couple cantos that I would like to do in detail next time you invite me back. And one is a thing called simony. It's the buying and selling of church offices. From Dante's point of view, it's responsible for the fact that the church is wealthy. And he sees most of the problems connected with wealth of the church. Okay? Here's what the simony joke says. I noticed that there were a great many KFCs around. This is a popular thing. I hope none of you go eat there. But, in the United States, needless to say, it's very big. So the Pope comes to the United States, and he's giving talks and everything. And a representative from KFC shows up and says to his secretary, I've got to speak with His Holiness. Well, he's busy. Well, this is important. So he goes in and he says, Holy Father, if you change the words of the Lord's Prayer, remember where it says, give us this day our daily bread? I want to change it. If you change it to give us this day our daily chicken, I will give you $25 million. So the Pope says, I can't do that. These are the words of our Lord himself. So the guy goes out, he makes a phone call, and he comes back and he says, tell you what, instead of $25 million, we are prepared to give you $250 million if you change this to give us this day our daily chicken. So the Pope says, this is an offer I can't refuse. He takes it. He goes back to Rome and he says, got good news and bad news. What's the good news, Holy Father? The good news is that we're $250 million richer. Okay. What's the bad news? We've lost the Bratislava bread account. The moral of the joke is what happens when everything is up for sale. What happens, in other words, when the only standard that you have to judge anything by is how much it costs. right? And there's no other way of judging anything. And Dante says that this is a particularly bad thing when it infects the church, that the church is there because it has a very specific spiritual mission, and all of the leaders of the church are involved in basically pretty crass politics that demand money that feeds and supplies armies that are doing battle all over Europe. And Dante sees this to be one of the very great evils of his time. So I guess I want to end with this notion that he's pretty serious about it. If you were to ask what profession, if you read the whole comedy, there are good guys and bad guys in every profession, good and bad kings, good and bad princes, good and bad carpenters, good and bad everything. The single profession that is most likely to send you to hell, or in which you will send yourself to hell, is being Pope. So, if you sort of ask somebody growing up in Dante's time, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be Pope. Think again. Because, of course, there's only one at a time, and therefore you don't have that many of the field to deal with. So what we won't get a chance to do, because of the constraints of time, is take a look at Canto 19, where what we get is this remarkable sequence in which one pope after the other is indicted for the sin of Simon. And Dante does the craziest and most wonderful thing. In 1300, the person who was pope, the person who was sitting on the chair of St. Peter, is a guy named Pope Boniface VIII. Pope Boniface VIII was the guy whose financial backing made the black Guelphs win out of the white Guelphs. And so he is the single person most responsible for Dante's exile. Well, Dante would very much like him to be in hell, of course, but he can't put him in hell because, of course, he's still alive. So what the poet does in this most wonderful, brilliant way is that when Dante the Pilgrim comes bopping down, the popes are all, or one pope at a time, is stuck in the rock with his feet sticking up and can't see anything. And he says, oh, is that you, Pope Boniface? I thought you weren't going to come here until a little later. So we know that Boniface's place in hell is exactly down there with the Simoniacs, but Dante is able to have plausible deniability. What's he talking about? Whereas he now has presented us with, and I think this is the only time he does it in the entire poem, somebody who is going to be in a very specific place in hell, who happens still to be alive at the time of the journey. So this and so many other things should send you scurrying to the comedy. Are we going to?
Thank you,
Yeah.
Ronom Hertzmanom. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2 years ago, we met first time John Sexton, and you participated, some of you, on his speech during our week, and he spoke about his favorite teacher. His name was Charlie. And John wrote me a couple of days ago, be careful because Ron is Charlie's favorite student. So we had the honor to be with Charlie's favorite student.
And I had the honor to be with you, which is quite wonderful. Great.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.